Welcome to our special edition of Women's Health. I am Luz Corcuera with Healthy Star Manatee. And today we have two very special guests. And I want to welcome Judy Norsiglan. Thank you for being with us, Judy, and Sonia Pressman Fuentes.
Hi, Luz.
What a pleasure to have both of you. These two women have shaped the history of women in the United States, and they continue to influence the women's movement. I'm going to briefly tell you who Judy is. Judy is one of the founders of Our Bodies, Ourselves, also known as the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. She has served as its executive director since 2001. She is an international renowned speaker and author on a range of women's health concerns. She has appeared on numerous national television and radio programs. Judy has been an author and editor for each of the 9 editions of Our Bodies, Ourselves, the organization's landmark book on women's health and sexuality. A new and revised edition published in 2011, 40 years after the book's initial publication, has received critical acclaim, including being named one of 8 best consumer health books of the year by Library Journal. Her personal recognitions include an honorary doctorate from Boston University, being named one of 21 leaders for the 21st century by Women's E-News, Public Service Award from the Massachusetts Public Health Association, Radcliffe College Alumni Association Annual Recognition Award, Boston YWCA's Academy of Women Achievers, and the Massachusetts Health Council Award. Wow. It is a real privilege and an honor to have you with us, Judy.
It's my pleasure to join you.
Thank you. And Sonia is equally remarkable. Sonia Pressman Fuentes was born in Berlin, Germany, and came to the United States with her family in 1934 to escape the Holocaust. She is a graduate of Cornell University and a graduate of the University of Miami, Florida School of Law. Sonia has been involved in women's rights since 1963, when she testified in Congress in favor of the passage of the Equal Pay Bill and joining in 1965 the General Counsel's Office of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as its first woman attorney. She is a co-founder of the National Organization for Women, now the Women's Equity Action League, and federally employed women on the national level and women in management. Sonia has received numerous awards, including the Veteran Feminist of America Medal of Honor, the 1999 Women at Work Award. Prior recipients include Jane Fonda, Katie Couric, and Hillary Clinton. She was one of 5 women inducted into the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame for the year 2000. She was honored by the Veteran Feminists of America as being one of 36 feminist lawyers in the U.S. who made significant contributions to women's rights in the 1963-75 time period, and one of 5 Jewish professional women to receive the Glass Ceiling Award from the Jewish Museum of Florida in Miami Beach, Florida in 2013. Sonia has lectured extensively in this country and abroad on women's rights and has written numerous articles on that subject. She has traveled as an American specialist on women's rights for the then U.S. Information Agency to France, Germany, Spain, Japan, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Indonesia. She is currently in the midst of interviews for the Trailblazing Women in the Law Project of the American Bar Association. After the completion of her interviews, her oral interview and a transcription of it will be housed in the Library of Congress. Sonia is a feminist activist, writer, and public speaker. She is also the author of a memoir, Eat First, You Don't Know What They Will Give You, The Adventures of an Immigrant Family and Their Feminist Daughter. So we have a wealth of knowledge, recognition, and influence at this table. My first question for both of you is going to be, how did you get involved in this movement? What motivated you to do so. So I'll start with Judy.
Well, Luz, I didn't even know the word feminism existed when I was an undergraduate, yet it was all around me. So it's an example of how you cannot observe the signs of change. I was born and brought up in a family where my father had escaped the Armenian genocide, he actually went to France and came to the United States at the age of 17 with no English. He had Armenian and French. And he had a strong sense of injustice, things he had perceived. There was a lot of discrimination against Armenian immigrants that he saw in Boston, which is where they settled. And so I grew up in a household where I had a father who was an intellectual. He loved math. He shared that with me. And I had an awareness of what happened with the genocide and with other social injustices. He was one of the first people to really make sure I understood what was going on with the civil rights movement. And though I certainly, growing up in high school and college, certainly knew a lot about that, but the seeds were planted. So when I first discovered the feminist movement, and it happened when I had already graduated and I was living communally, and we were exploring all kinds of alternative forms of learning, social change in various formats, I came across feminism. And when I came back to Boston after living a year away, I immediately connected with a group of women that was fluid at that point. We had not incorporated yet, that ultimately became the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. And it was really from that time on I was hooked onto these issues. My segue into the women's health movement and the women's movement was originally through things like nutrition and reproductive health issues, but it branched off into many other issues. And at heart, I was a feminist. I just didn't even have the language for it.
That is wonderful. Lucky for all of us women to have you. And Sonia, how did you get involved in this movement?
Well, it also goes back, I was interested to hear Judy's comments, because I guess mine also goes back to my childhood. I always say that there were 3 influences on my getting involved in the women's movement. And the first one was that my parents were living in Berlin, Germany, and they had a 14-year-old son, my brother Herman, and my mother became pregnant with me. And she'd already had 7 abortions because she always told me it wasn't fashionable for well-to-do people in Berlin to have a lot of children. So when she became pregnant with me, she went to have an abortion. And she had 2 abortionists, and the one she preferred was out of the country at the time. So she came home intending to go to the other one, and when she told my father, he said, let it be already. So that's how I was born. So that was an influence on me that my life was saved because I felt there was something that I was meant to do. And then there was a second influence like that, in that we escaped in 1933. We left Germany in 1933 and were in Belgium for a while, and then came to the United States. So my life was saved a second time. And those 2 things, and the third one was that I was bright. And those
You are still bright.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
So those 3 things made me feel that there was something in the world I was saved to do, but I didn't know what they were. And I couldn't mention it to anybody, or they would have thought I was arrogant or crazy or whatever. So I never mentioned that, but it was always part of me. So then I went to Cornell University for undergraduate and University of Miami, Florida for law school. But I was always looking for that job that I was meant to do while my life was saved. So I eventually found my way with a new agency called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which opened on July 2nd, 1965. And its mandate was to enforce a new law called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited employment discrimination by employers, labor unions, and employment agency based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And I was the first woman lawyer in the Office of the General Counsel of that agency. So when I came to work there, I didn't have any agenda. I had never thought about women's rights. There wasn't really such an issue at that time. But what happened was that the prohibition against sex discrimination came into the act during its later stages. And the amendment to include sex discrimination, which was not included in the bill initially, the bill was passed really as a result of the civil rights movement for Black Americans. But during the later stages of the debate, Howard Smith, a segregationist congressman, introduced an amendment to include sex. And so sex came into the act when the people working there, the commissioners and the staff and the country at large, weren't really prepared for a prohibition against sex discrimination as they were by the civil rights movement. So during the first year or so, I witnessed the fact that the commission really didn't want to enforce the prohibitions against sex discrimination. And I found that very frustrating, and that's what led to my, well, and then Betty Friedan came to the office. I should mention that. Betty Friedan, who published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, came to the office to interview my boss, the general counsel, and his deputy. But she saw me, a woman, there, so she asked me what was going on. And I was very frustrated because the commission wasn't doing anything about women's rights. And I took her into the privacy of my office, and I told her that what this country needed was an organization to fight for women, like the NAACP fought for its constituency. And shortly after that, NOW was founded.
Great
Wow.
moment in time. Very
Perfect.
glad you did that.
Yeah. And so I am going back in time and thinking, you know, of the two of you with all that energy and those brains at work. You probably encountered some critical barriers and a lot of hurdles in the work that you were meaning and trying to accomplish. What it was like for you then and there?
Well, for Our Bodies, Ourselves, we formed out of a workshop that was held at one of the first women's liberation conferences. They were being held all over the country, and one was at Emmanuel College in Boston in the spring of 1969. And it's interesting that that was a Catholic girls' school as well. And the women were meeting to talk about our bodies, everything about our bodies that, you know, had posed questions for us, and including sexuality, healthcare. And they were so electrified by not only the questions they had and the lack of information, that, you know, their ignorance, they decided to continue meeting. And it actually became some sort of a self-study group. They began to do research. They went to the local Countway Medical Library at Harvard Medical School. They decided to start community courses to bring women together, to share their experiences, as well as to gain what knowledge they could from whatever written material or conversations with receptive doctors and nurses whom they could find. Now, mind you, this was the heyday of sexism, paternalism, and condescension in medicine, for men too, but especially for women. So if you asked a question in the doctor's office, you were told, you know, basically, don't worry your pretty little head. You get a pat on the top of your head and told to go home. And that's not the way to provide good medical care. As we know now, you need to ask questions, you need to engage with your providers. So this was a very radical thing to do, to start asking questions, to do your own research, and to uncover the fact that very little good research had been done on a whole host of women's health issues. As we began to investigate these issues, we discovered there were a lot of unnecessary hysterectomies. Even then, there were unnecessary cesareans, routine episiotomies done for no good evidence. So it was an interesting moment for us to begin to understand, educate ourselves about how our bodies work, to figure out there was such a thing as postpartum depression when the medical literature didn't contain anything about it. And of course, abortion was still illegal then. And we were among those who began to fight to legalize abortion. It became legal in '73, but the first edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves, which came out as a newsprint edition with another title, was December of 1970. And then we adopted the title Our Bodies, Ourselves in 1971. But it wasn't until the commercial edition in '73, put out by Simon & Schuster, that the book really took off and became a bestseller. It was clearly needed. This information was so vital for all of us that it was part of a women's health movement that probably had its heyday in the 90s. It was still strong in the 21st century, but not as strong as it was in the latter part of the 20th century. So we continue the work, and so do other women's health groups, and our issues are somewhat different. But we're very, very committed to the original principles of, women's autonomy, the right to be treated with respect, with consideration, and to be your own person. We wanted women to be full participants in society, both at the level of making choices for ourselves, but also at the community level, where we're setting policies for the citizens, for the state, for the country. And of course, that means getting women elected and getting men and women to pay attention to women's issues. So it was a vast, vast area and a big challenge.
And
Judy,
a lot of work.
Judy, the other night you were talking that it was initially called Their Bodies, and I thought that was interesting. Do you want to tell that?
Yes, when it first came out in December of 1970, the book title was Women and Their Bodies. And it was in that ensuing month or two that the women said, this is a good example of how divorced we are from our bodies. We don't know very much. And so we named this thing Women in Their Bodies. Well, they're our bodies. So with the very first second printing, they changed the title to Our Bodies, Ourselves. And of course, that's become iconic. It's our bodies, our cars, ourselves, our teddies, ourselves. We've been, our jeans, ourselves. We've counted about 110 takeoffs on Our Bodies, Ourselves. And I think it's interesting that something like that has sort of gotten hold in the culture.
Those of us who have a book, we consider this almost like the Bible of women's health. And so it's so important that we know the history and we know all the struggles, to get where we are today.
But I will tell you that in this day and age, it's very hard for any book, even a book that has this 40-something year history, to become visible to most of the public. You've got so much noise on the internet, you have social media, you have cable stations, you have so many media outlets that it is very difficult. I'm told by students on college campuses that they would never have known about Our Bodies, Ourselves if it weren't for the women's studies course they took, or the gift from an aunt or their parents when they were in high school, that it was the kind of gem that would not have entered their lives if an adult hadn't pointed them in the right direction. On some campuses, students have said their copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves was dog-eared on the dorm floor in the lounge by everybody else because nobody had seen it before. So we have a long way to go to reach young women with this kind of information, and young men.
And actually, we've posted your website on the information. So if people want to get a copy of the book and they want to subscribe to your blog, they can just go to the website that
Yes,
we
the
posted.
blog is free and people should just sign up. You have to do that for yourselves. And we also have a good email list if you want to be sort of apprised of the latest hot topic. But the most important thing is that the blog and the website get updated regularly. So if something in Our Bodies, Ourselves happens to change, the website is the place you can get the most recent information. Certainly the political landscape is changing all the time, as we well know.
Exactly. Well, so Sonia, what about you when you were trying to get into this movement and you were the only woman, that got stuck in my head in that office and they pay attention to you because you were a woman?
Well, I wasn't the only woman at the EOC, or the first woman at the EOC. I was the first woman in the Office of the General Counsel, which at that time only consisted of 4 people: the General Counsel, his deputy, myself, and a younger attorney. It was very difficult the first year because the people at the commission, both the commissioners, the 5 commissioners, and there were about 100 employees altogether, had come there to fight employment discrimination primarily based on race. They were not there to fight gender discrimination. Moreover, in their defense, whether or not something is an act of discrimination based on race is generally black and white. It's not that difficult legally to decide. But sex discrimination raised a host of issues of interpretation. And nobody knew how to interpret the act. And they didn't want to spend the commission's time and money trying to figure out how to interpret this act. Furthermore, there was a split among some women. Esther Peterson and another woman, Mary Kaiserling, were opposed to sex discrimination being in Title VII. They thought it should be in a separate act. And they were also opposed to Title VII superseding state protective legislation. The states had all kinds of laws which were initially passed, I think for a good reason, against sweatshop conditions for women. They tried to get such laws passed for both sexes. They didn't think they'd succeed. So they got laws passed for women, protecting women. So women could only, in various states, they could only work certain hours. They couldn't work at night. They had to have lunch and rest periods, things like that. They had to have benches to sit. But in our time, those laws were keeping women. They couldn't lift more than a certain amount of weight. So in our time, those laws, which were meant to protect women, were keeping women from getting jobs, from getting hired and getting promoted. But people like Esther Peterson and Mary Kaiserling came out of the labor union movement. They were devoted to those laws, and they didn't want them superseded by Title VII. So people who weren't in favor of rights for women glommed onto the fact that there were women who opposed it, and they said, well, if the women aren't together on this, we're not going to do anything about it. So what happened with me was that whenever an issue came up, I always said, well, what about sex discrimination? So my boss, the general counsel, took to calling me a sex maniac because I always raised the issue of sex discrimination. And it was a difficult place to work because all the people in power, the chairman, the executive director, they were all men. And most of them there were some commissioners like Eileen Hernandez and Dick Graham who were concerned about women's rights, but most of the staff and the commissioners were not. So I was always in the position of being the sole person fighting. I had no power, I was just an attorney, fighting against people with power. And I remember sometimes I'd go home from work and tears would be rolling down my face because I didn't know how I had gotten into this position of fighting for women's rights. Nobody had elected me to do that. And I was basically alone at that agency. There were at least one other woman there who favored women's rights, but she did not want to come out in the open about it. She worked for the vice chairman, Luther Holcomb, who was not for women, and her name was Van Swift, and she favored women's rights, as I said, but she did not want to be the point person for that. So I was basically on my own. As I mentioned, there were a couple of commissioners who felt that way, but they were much higher than I was. So it was a difficult, frustrating position until NOW was formed.
So speaking of NOW, earlier you were mentioning that an important word, it's National Organization for Women and not of women.
Right.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
When we were founding NOW, we had a whole discussion about that because the initial idea was to call it the National Organization of Women. But then people made the point that we had male supporters, we had male members of among the founders. I think there was one male founder, Carl Degnan, and we didn't want to give the impression that the organization was to be limited to women. So that's why we called it the National Organization for Women, to make it clear to men that they were welcome to join with us.
Excellent. So let's move into women's health. I am very passionate about maternal child health, and I see some things still happening. Women not having access to prenatal care. And I feel that looking at pregnancy and childbirth, in looking at those issues, we have to take into consideration all the cumulative factors throughout lifespan. And for me, those include socioeconomic issues, race, that not too many people really want to talk about it. And we talk about the health disparities, but it's almost like the big elephant in the room that no one wants to touch. How do you see race, culture, language in terms of women's health today?
Well, we have to remember that the single most important determinant of health and well-being is poverty. Lack of poverty or not. And if we can do away with poverty, we would do away with a lot of the poor health that women and families endure. Of course, that's a very large task for all of us, and we do keep our eyes on that prize. The other issue, though, is how we handle health and medical problems. Really, it's not primarily about medical care. When you think about the bigger picture, our health is largely created by certainly poverty, but it's the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the safety of our environment. And I'm thinking both in terms of occupational, environmental safety, but also bodily safety. Is there violence in the community? Is there violence in a woman's family, in her own life? And certainly if you do these surveys, as people have done all over the world, and you pick certain countries, certain communities, and ask women what's the biggest threat to your health and well-being, they're going to say violence. Either there's civil war or domestic violence. They don't say it's because I can't find a doctor. So that's something to remember as well. But when you get to the point, say you're in the United States, we're a very rich country, there is no excuse for our inability to provide much needed primary care services to women, men, and children, everyone who needs them. We are a very rich country, but we have rationed care in a way that is unconscionable. And so very often in the women's health movement and the progressive health movement, you will see an effort to change that, either through a single-payer form of health care, getting rid of the insurance industry, for example, would have been the ideal thing. And the Affordable Care Act was very much a compromise between what we needed, what would have served our interests best, and what was possible politically. So we're still carrying in our website at Our Bodies Ourselves a section that talks about why a national health plan is best for women's health. We have 6 major principles, and we talk about those. We think that we would have been able to eliminate the inappropriate financial incentives, particularly in women's health, the overuse of hysterectomy, the overuse of obstetric interventions. If we could have gotten rid of fee-for-service, where there were incentives to use technologies, even when they weren't in the best interests of the woman or the patient, we would have made a lot of progress sooner. Some of the progress we failed to make, they did make in the UK, where they had a National Health Service, and they could point to much better indicators of health and well-being because they had universal health care and they didn't use interventions that weren't of benefit, cost us money, didn't on the other side produce any benefit, and they had better outcomes. So if you look at, say, childbirth, maternity care in this country, we are doing during pregnancy, but particularly during birth, a lot that we don't need to be doing, and we're not following what I would call best practices in the field based on the best available information and literature. It's beginning to happen. Even within the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, there are lots of spokespersons saying, we've got to do something, and we know the things we need to do to reduce this unconscionably high cesarean section rate. It's not like this 1 in 3 and rising cesarean rate has led to better outcomes. No, and in fact, in some cases, we can point to worsening outcomes. We've got to do something to use the best practices. Sometimes these are the low-tech practices, simply watching and waiting, for example. And it's one of the reasons why Our Bodies Ourselves and many other women's health groups have become great advocates of midwives. We've worked closely with the American College of Nurse Midwives. We wish there could be a nurse midwifery service in every hospital that provides maternity care in the whole country. We would like to see a freestanding birth center staffed by midwives and family practice doctors, people who want to work in these freestanding birth centers in every community in the country, ultimately, because it's high-quality care for low-risk childbearing women, and it's cheaper as well. The outcomes are superb. And then for the very small percentage of families who choose and want to have their babies at home, we want to keep home birth as safe as possible through licensing and certifying and regulating certified professional midwives. So we talk about these issues at our website. We're very active, for example, in Massachusetts now, where our legislature is considering licensure and regulation of certified professional midwives. Just one example.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk on this subject with regard to the law with regard to pregnancy, and also something we did here in this area with regard to pregnancy. Before Title VII, there were no protections under the law given to women. Title VII said you can't discriminate, an employer can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So one of the early issues that faced us as the commission was, what does this mean with regard to pregnancy? Does an employer have to hire a woman who's pregnant? Does he have to keep her on if she's working and he finds out she's pregnant? In the past, school boards used to fire school teachers when they became pregnant, and the theory was that it wouldn't be good for children to see pregnant school teachers because they would realize they'd had sexual intercourse. So they fired them. And so that was one of the early questions. What about pregnancy and Title VII? Well, and there was a split of opinion. I had one opinion, and then I had to draft the Commission's guidelines with the other opinion. My feeling was that in Europe, pregnancy is considered a unique condition, and there are special rules and laws with regard to pregnancy. And I thought we should go in that direction. We should study what's been done in Europe and other countries, and then adopt something similar. The EOC didn't do that, partially because they felt that they only have a right to rule with regard to equality. They couldn't set forth new standards like they did in Europe. So the EOC adopted the principle that there are different phases of pregnancy. First, it's when you're pregnant before the child is born. Then you have the child born, then you have post-delivery. So they said with regard to these three phases, however an employer treats its other employees who need time off or pay when they have to be away for either illness or for they just want time off to go visit their grandmother or to go to college, however the employer treats other conditions similar, the employer has to treat women in connection with pregnancy.
Can I ask you a question,
Sure.
Sonia? Because I was just thinking back to the Johnson Controls case, which was a situation in which women had to prove that they were sterilized, or they had to be in a situation where they could not get pregnant because they were working with toxic substances and they didn't want to deal with somebody becoming infertile as a result. Didn't that case go all the way to the Supreme Court?
I've heard about that issue. I'm not familiar with that case. I remember reading, however, that toxic substances can be deleterious to men who may become fathers.
That's right.
As they are to women. But I'm not familiar with what happened on that case.
Well, the long and short of it is that our side won in the end. And I think it's really important that we make the workplace safe for everyone. In fact, that very point was raised, that if something is a risk to women, a risk to women's fertility, it's probably a risk to male fertility as well. So we really have to have workplaces that are safer for everybody. And you're not going to say, well, we're not going to let you work here because you might get infertile or you might have a baby born with a serious disability, a serious health problem. And what's interesting is that it took a lot of women's activism all over the country to do something about not just workplace exposures, but also environmental exposures. I remember in one of the early editions of Our Bodies, Our Cells, we covered a story that took place in the Northwest. I think it was Washington State. Northwest Coalition Against Pesticides, NCAP. And what the women had noticed is that they were coming in with planes, low-flying planes, and they were spreading very toxic pesticides over the whole area. Some of these were actually defoliating agents, and I think in one community they were using 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. These were the defoliation agents that our U.S. government used in Vietnam, and you've all seen the results of that. What happened is that the women noticed that out of, say, 7 pregnancies that followed in the community, they were all stillborn or there were serious birth problems. And they said, this isn't a coincidence. This has to be because we were exposed. The wind carried these very strong pesticides and toxic substances into the community, into the watershed, and everyone who was getting pregnant at that time was exposed. And it was really the activism of groups like that and the women in the coal mines in West Virginia, stories like that which we covered in Our Bodies, Our Cells, that inspired us to really support women as workers and women as agents for change in the community so that the environment wouldn't make our health worse than it was already.
Terrific.
Yes, and we still have that problem here that has a large farm worker population. We have women who are exposed to pesticides and they are not even allowed to receive proper prenatal care. It's a fight for our community health workers to convince the crew leaders for those women to go to the clinic. And unfortunately, like in every program, when I'm having so much fun, the time is always our #1 enemy. And so I want to invite you, Judy, to come back to Sarasota, Manatee, and grace us with your presence and with your knowledge again. But I want to take advantage of what time we have left and ask you to, if you could focus on one message that you want to deliver today for all the women, families, people in decision-making positions that are watching this program, what would that be?
Well, it's really hard to think of just one message, but I would say that our reproductive challenges, reproductive justice is a term I like to use for this, whether it's in birthing, whether it's in contraception, access to abortion, that full reproductive health services need to be accessible to all women who need them. And I think we're seeing women's access to services and access to choices dwindling in many parts of the country. So I would say we have to pay a lot of attention there. And then we also have to think about the environmental issues, climate change, the quality of the food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink. All of these things are so critically important to the health of everybody in our communities.
So by advocating for the health of the family and the women, we are also assuring our next generation's health.
Absolutely. A healthy environment is good for the earth, Mother Earth, and it's good for all of us who live on it.
Thank you, Judy. What about you, Sonia?
Well, the important thing that I would like to get across is that since the mid-60s and early 70s, we have had nothing less than a legal revolution in the rights of women in this country. And it has slipped over and it is affecting the rest of the world. There's no question about it. Economist Eli Ginsberg said that the most important phenomenon of the 20th century was the number and proportion of women who work. However, it's also important to remember that the battle is far from won. Some people think, oh, women have achieved everything in the last few decades and that battle is over. And that's far from the truth. When I give talks, I end them these days with talking about the remaining problems. I just picked some major remaining problems, and in the United States I have about 27, and in the rest of the world I have those and another 12 or so. So there are many areas left where, both in the United States and abroad, where we have to continue this fight.
Well, thank you so much, Judy and Sonia, for being with us today. It's a very thought-provoking conversation, and it feels that we just touched the surface. So I hope that we have an opportunity for both of you to come back and continue exploring this very important topic.
Thanks for having us,
Thank you.
Luz.
And for all of you who are watching our program, I encourage you to check both websites. You can see that we have a lot to learn from these ladies. And on behalf of Manatee Educational Television, I thank you, Judy and Sonia, and I thank everyone for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay?